We've got, what, 15 days, I think it is now, till the general election. I am definitely counting them down. Hurry up, please. Let's catch up, shall we, with what we've missed today on the campaign trail. Let's cross live to, this time, the Labour battle bus. Our GBNews political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Bring us up to speed with all the latest, Olivia.
Hello, yes, I've just got off the Labour battle bus in Yorkshire. Keir Starmer is under a lot of pressure today about raising taxes. He has said time and again that he will not be raising the three main taxes for working people, i.e. income tax, national insurance or VAT. But he has been very careful not to rule out rises to other taxes. And it's now widely predicted that Labour will raise taxes on capital gains, possibly council tax too, and inheritance tax if and when they come into power. And I say when because two devastating polls for the Conservatives have just dropped this evening. That's the Savanta poll and the MRP YouGov poll. Now, both of them suggest that the Tories will be almost wiped out. The Savanta poll, which is the splash on the Daily Telegraph, suggests that the Tories could go down to just 56 seats, with Keir Starmer's Labour Party on a 382-seat majority. It could, in fact, mean that the Lib Dems become the official opposition. The Lib Dems on that poll are on 50 seats, with the Conservatives on just 56. So just a handful of seats would need to change hands, sort of margin of error territory, for the Conservatives to go down into third place and the Lib Dems to leapfrog them. The other huge poll that's come out today is that MRP poll for YouGov. That puts Labour on a 202-seat majority with over 400 seats, 425 seats. That's more than Labour won under Tony Blair in 1997 and would in fact be the second biggest majority in a general election since the Second World War. So this is really, really devastating stuff for the Conservatives this evening. They were smiling about inflation this morning. They're not smiling anymore.
Oh, I can imagine that they are not. Olivia, thank you very much. It looks beautiful where you are, and you can absolutely tell it is Yorkshire. God's finest county, that's what I've got to say. I mean, goodness gracious me, there is so much to unpack tonight. Where do we even start? We've got the George Galloway Workers' Party. That has been announced their manifesto. I'll come on to some of the things that George Galloway said in just a second. But those polls that we've just been mentioning there, it's terrible news for the Tories, Peter.
Well, I suppose it is if you believe opinion polls are necessarily right. I've been saying from the beginning of this election that people are allowing themselves to be manipulated by the polls into holding the opinion that the election is finished before it started. It may be so. I would point out that on exactly this day, June the 19th, 1970, Conservative government was just settling into Downing Street, having beaten Harold Wilson's Labour government in an election which everybody said that Labour would win. The night before that election, all three major opinion polls gave Labour a majority of about 75, and they lost the election. Polls can be wrong. I would point out that these days hardly anybody answers the front door. Ask anybody who's done any canvassing during this election. People don't come to the front door, nor do they answer the telephone. I'm archaic. I still use the telephone to ring people up and expect an answer. This is very rare. People don't do it. How are the polls collecting their information?
That's a very good point.
The other thing is that the raw work of polls, I've done a lot of work on this, before the 2010 election. The papers were all saying David Cameron was going to walk it and be Prime Minister. The BBC was poised for his ride to Downing Street on the night of the election. He didn't win because it was wrong. And if you looked at the raw figures, which I did on that occasion, it was plainly wrong. And I just caution people: don't be a sheep. If you have an idea as to which way you want to vote, don't allow yourself to be corralled into voting by what you think everybody else is doing. If it turns out that everybody else isn't doing it, you're going to look very silly indeed, aren't you?
Are you going to hit that warning from Peter Hitchens? What do you think to that? Do you agree with what he's saying or not? Aaron, your thoughts?
Well, in India, where, of course, they've just recently had an election, you don't have polls during the election campaign. Mm-hmm. And I see the merits of that, because what we should be discussing is the politics and the individuals. Is Keir Starmer prepared to be the Prime Minister? Is Ed Davey going to be a sufficiently adequate leader of the opposition, etc., etc., etc.? That should be at the centre of the debate during this campaign. But, of course, we have this plethora of polls coming out seemingly every day, and they become the conversation instead. I think we could do with having fewer polls. That said, I think the big story here is clearly that a good result for the Conservatives, a good result, would look like 1997, where, of course, Labour ended up with a majority of something like 156. Peter can correct me if that's wrong.
No, I can't remember. But
something like that.
I was going to mention 97 there because it reminds me very strongly of that in two ways. One, the assumption throughout the election that Labour were going to win. And the general trivial-minded nature of the campaign. Almost nothing of any seriousness was discussed during the 97 campaign at all. It was all superficial froth. But it was probably the most significant election since 1945. And we have, again, an election of enormous importance in which a party of immensely powerful, dogmatic ideology, led by a strongly ideological Prime Minister, is about to come to office if the polls are right. And there is almost no discussion of the nature of the government which he will introduce at all, just trivia. Fascinating, I have to say, Nick Ferrari deserves a huge medal for yesterday asking Keir Starmer the question which everybody who interviewed him should have asked him before. What do you mean by working people? Now, this is a huge development. Here we actually have, at last, Keir Starmer beginning to show that, in fact, he's planning to whack the middle classes with an enormous amount of tax. But he's only begun to say so now, and it's not catching on.
Can I just tell people what happened in that interview in case people didn't see it? So Keir Starmer was essentially asked, because obviously he's saying that he's not going to raise taxes on working people, and he was asked, well, what do you define as working people? Long story short, he basically said people that work for a living, yeah, fine, whatever. But then he went on to say people that essentially can't write a cheque out if something goes wrong. So essentially people that have no savings whatsoever. That is my understanding of what he said.
So he's going for the people with savings, and this is because that's where there's an awful lot of money which the government can plunder. And that's what he will do. And I think we've been told this. Now, you'd think, wouldn't you, the middle classes of England warned so clearly that an incoming government was going to plunder their savings, would say, actually, perhaps it's not such a good idea to vote Labour or to vote for the Reform Party, which means voting Labour, that we might not do that. But no. Have you been watching this extraordinary series on television, The Fall, about the woman who her husband tried to murder her in a parachute jump?
I have not.
She would know. It's fascinating.
My mother-in-law loves that.
The key thing about it is that the victim of this extraordinary crime eventually ended up giving very feeble evidence against the man who tried to kill her because she couldn't bring herself to believe that her own husband had been trying to kill her. It's amazing what people are able to suppress in their minds if they want to, and people are suppressing in their minds at the moment because of this desire to punish the Tories. The truth about this election, which is that we face an enormously radical Labour government, which everybody who helps to get it in, who has any savings, will regret like anything for years and years to come. And once you've got it, I promise you, you won't be able to get rid of it. When they move in, they come to stay.
But surely people wouldn't be, or shouldn't be, surprised by that. I don't really see why this is a revelation that people are saying that Labour is going to tax success or tax aspiration, because essentially that is what the Labour Party is known for, certainly in my mind.
There's a few ways of looking at it, isn't there? I suppose one counter-argument is we're already taxed to the hilt and we get very little for it. If we're going to be taxed even more and we get something in return, OK, so be it.
But what do you think?
Well,
do you think they're suddenly going to get better at spending it once they've got more of it?
Well, I suppose Labour can say we've got a benchmark in 2010, crime was lower, the NHS was better, etc. So they can say that. They can say that, Peter. They can say that quite reasonably. They can say that quite reasonably. And the electorate often thinks in those terms, don't they? For better or worse, they think of the last Labour government. And I think that's quite a reasonable one. On things like, for instance, capital gains tax, I think only 3 people in every 100 have paid that since 2010. What worries people more is things like potential increases to inheritance tax, moving that around, the idea of capital gains being imposed on a first property, which of course would mean everybody having to pay for it. That worries people, but so far Labour are saying we won't do that. I do think they'll increase capital gains tax, which doesn't impact that many people, and I do think if they get a big majority, although they've said they won't, I think they'll reorganise council tax.
Of course they will.
Because it's just something that they want to do, and you need a massive majority to get away with it.
They will weaponise council tax. It's a fantastic tool in their hands, if they want to go after the people who they don't think will ever vote for them again.
But let me pick you up on something that you just said, because at the start of this programme you were saying to everyone, oh, just ignore the polls, basically, don't be a sheep, just vote the way that your heart desires, basically. And then in the next breath, 2 minutes ago, you then said, you know, a vote for reform is a vote for the Labour Party.
Yes.
So people will hear that and they'll be shouting at their screen going, no, actually a vote for reform is a vote for reform.
Well, no, that's because they don't understand the British electoral system. Well, I mean, it's like, in that case, they should really consider whether they're fit to vote. It's like getting into a car without knowing how to drive. If you vote for reform in a two-party system in this election, you will be voting Labour. That is the effect which your vote will have. It's perfectly simple and straightforward, and it's beyond doubt. So if you want a Labour government, vote reform. If you don't want a Labour government, don't do that. The only way to stop a Labour government is to vote against it in any constituency where you are, where you work out, it's not very difficult, which is the party most likely to beat Labour, and then you vote for them. You don't have to vote for anybody. But it's just extraordinary how so many people have deluded themselves, like victims of crime, into the belief that they have nothing to fear. There's an enormous amount to fear. Keir Starmer is, as I said, the most powerfully ideological person to be within range of Downing Street, practically in my lifetime.
What face did you just pull?
I'm curious. Why isn't Peter on the reform train? Because many of the...
I don't like them. I think they're mistaken.
What, do you like the Conservative Party, though?
No, I don't.
I think many of the critiques that you have of the Conservative Party, people that vote reform would agree with.
It would be no gain to me to support a party led by a man who believes in the decriminalisation of marijuana. Nigel Farage is not a Conservative.
Is Rishi Sunak?
No, but he doesn't actually come out and say publicly he thinks marijuana should be legalised. And what we're being asked here is not which one to have. Nigel Farage could not. Nigel Farage talks about 2029. He knows perfectly well that he's got absolutely no chance of getting anywhere near office, and probably very little chance of becoming a member of Parliament in this election, because he understands the electoral system better than most people. You can't say, right, well, I won't have Rishi Sunak, I'll have Nigel Farage. You'll have if you don't have Rishi Sunak, you'll have Keir Starmer, and that is what you will have, and there isn't any way out of it. And you might believe that in 5 years' time, after 5 years of Keir Starmer, the country will suddenly come to its senses and say, right, we'll vote for Nigel Farage instead. But by that time, 16-year-olds will be voting, and also, by my guess, almost certainly EU citizens living in Britain will be voting. So your chances of getting a majority for reform in 2029 are pretty slender. These people are not going to give up.
Well, there you go. What do you think to it? Do you even know the way you are going to vote? And when you hear things like that, does it change your mind or not?